Welcome, Dana. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate your time. We know you're a very, very busy person. Dana Morse joined the Marine Extension Team in 1998, and that's the extension team at the University of Maine Extension Cooperative Extension Service. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have a joint appointment, mostly with the Maine Sea Grant program, but I also am an employee of the University of Maine Cooperative Extension.
Great. You're based out of Darling Marine Center,
Yep.
And that's located in Walpole, Maine. Your work is around education, technology transfer, and applied research, and your focus is on shellfish production and training, methods, equipment, and techniques to improve and diversify production for species such as oysters, mussels, scallops, soft-shell clams, razor clams, and so much more. Is that a fair representation of what you do?
It is.
Okay. You collaborate with several people around the state to deliver training for new producers and to create opportunities for professional development for established producers. And is that on the idea of the Shared Waters course that you participate in at Coastal Enterprises, Inc.?
That's right. Yep. We've run that program a number of places and a number of times around the state. And CEI has been one of our partners right from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And it'll be great if you could share a little more about that, because I was in that course, not this last winter, but the winter before.
Yep.
And it's an incredibly valuable course, and I would encourage anyone who has the opportunity to take it. It's excellent.
Thanks.
I noticed that in my class there were 30 of us, and none of us missed any time in the class. That says a lot about what's going on in that course.
Yeah.
So a little bit about your education background. You have a BS in Wildlife Management from the University of New Hampshire. You're a graduate of 1986. And then you have an MS, or a Master's of Science degree in Fisheries Technology and Aquaculture at the University of Rhode Island. Your professional organizations include Maine Aquaculture Association, National Shell Fisheries Association, and World Aquaculture Society. Is there any other than that? That's amazing.
Yeah, the professional memberships kind of wax and wane, but those are ones that I've been participating with pretty constantly over the years.
That's great. So that's what I have. Do you have anything you'd like to add to the background?
No, that was pretty comprehensive. I guess I will say that, yeah, I've been on the job for a while, and I have loved it right from the beginning. This has been such a wonderful, encouraging, kind of rejuvenating job. But my path here was definitely not a straight line. I didn't get hired on this job until I was 33 years old. And at that point, I'd been through undergraduate and graduate school. I had done a bunch of work doing different things. And I was kind of wondering sort of where my career was and where I was headed. And am I going to find something that I really enjoyed and would pay me enough to live on for a while? And through one thing and another, I totally got lucky. And I've dug it ever since.
Oh, that's great. Are you a native Mainer?
I am.
You are. Where did you grow up?
Cape Elizabeth, but I really grew up in New Hampshire.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, gathered around this afternoon are the instructors at the Booth Bay Sea and Science Center, and they come with varied backgrounds. And we've come up with a number of questions that we've shared with you, and we'd like to start in on the questions.
So for our first question, Jackie wanted to know, do they grow from seeds?
The scallops now.
Yes.
Yeah, they do. Juvenile shellfish are usually referred to as seed or spat, kind of depending on who you're talking to and what size range we're talking about. And sea scallops, Placopecten magellanicus, or the Atlantic sea scallop, all of the seed that's being used in production now in Maine comes from the wild. None of it is hatchery raised. And even though there have been a lot of attempts to successfully produce sea scallops in the hatchery, none of them have really succeeded. They're difficult to grow in the hatchery. So the farms that are growing sea scallops nowadays, they all collect their own seed, and they use a piece of equipment called a spat collector to do that.
How did you get into scallop farming?
I lucked out, basically. In 1999, my second year on the job, I got lucky. I was not on the intended list of people, but a couple people could not make it to a trip to Aomori Prefecture in Japan. Well, those people got kind of run through. I was further down on the list. They asked me. I said, "Yeah, I totally want to go." I tagged along, and I got a chance to see something about how they collect spat over there, which we have learned a ton from the Japanese ever since. Got exposed to some of the size of their industry, what their waterfronts look like, how their science was involved, how they were processed and packaged. And we came back with a much clearer understanding of this spat collection process using these spat collectors. And then part of my job was to spread the word about how to use spat collectors. Once we had some seed available, because the fishermen proved very good, no surprise there. Our commercial fishermen are pretty good at what they do. So they found ways of fishing for seed pretty quickly. And then we had all these babies to work on. And I had established a lease at the Darling Center, and I got a hold of some of those scallop seed and started holding them and making some observations on how they grew, how they moved, what their behavior was like. And I got hooked. It was great. That's my story.
Are there more than one species of scallops?
Yes, I will probably get this wrong, but I think there are around 70 species of scallops. Maine has one native species, Placopecten. We have had very occasional incursions of Aquapecten radians, formerly Argopecten, which is the bay scallop. And we have had hatchery production of bay scallops as well. But there's a bunch of species worldwide.
For the species of scallops that you're growing, what is their geographical distribution?
Placopecten ranges from pretty much the Baie de Chaleur in New Brunswick and around the shores of Newfoundland and maybe Labrador, down roughly as far as Virginia. And you can find them anywhere from almost intertidal, when populations are good, down to a few hundred meters or 100 fathoms easily.
Where do scallops grow? So do you have them in like pens in the ocean or in like holding tanks?
In the wild, they're very patchily distributed. And so for commercial fishermen, this makes it convenient because you can kind of go to a bed of scallops and fish on them and be efficient that way. They tend to like reasonable flow. They don't like it slow, and they don't like it when the current is ripping past them. But because they do like higher flow areas, they're usually found on a little bit coarser substrate. You won't find them on soft mud because that's where the currents are slow, and those are quote-unquote depositional areas. So you'll find them on sand and gravel. You'll find them on shell hash, cobble areas as well. Some places where the current is enough to erode sediment from the bottom a little bit. In culture, they have been tried all kinds of different ways. Anything from simply moving small ones to an area of good bottom where they can grow, and that's usually referred to as transplanting or ranching. The systems that we're using in Maine are a mixture of some for bottom cage culture. So these are structures that sit right on the bottom. There are a variety of ways where the scallops are held right in the middle of the water, using a lantern net or a pearl net, or the system that the Japanese have created called ear hanging, which you may have heard about, and you drill a little hole in the shell and hang them from a string or a pin.
Can anyone grow scallops?
Anyone who can get the proper permissions, principally from the state. So Maine Department of Marine Resources has jurisdiction and stewardship of submerged lands. So that means anything from mean low water out to the 3-mile mark. So you need permission from the Department of Marine Resources if you want to hold animals in any kind of a structure. So if you want a cage or a lantern net, you have to apply for permission from DMR to do that, and there's a couple of ways around that. It will also include permission from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and possibly the U.S. Coast Guard as well. It's a little bit of a complicated answer, but as long as you can meet those criteria and get those permissions, then yes, you can grow scallops.
Are there only specific places in Maine that you can grow them?
Generally speaking, there are some places that are closed for the culture of shellfish, and those are usually places where the water is polluted, either because of too much bacteria or perhaps things like heavy metals. So having said that, aside from those areas that are closed by the state, the rest of the state is kind of open territory. Now, you probably wouldn't want to try to have a farm right in the middle of a cove where people go lobster fishing all the time, because that's a current use that would be an immediate conflict. When any of us who are working with growers start talking about site selection, that's a complicated and really important discussion, because you have to think about, where's the temperature right? Where's the salinity right? Is it in the middle of a fishing area? Is the water quality good there, meaning bacteria and those kinds of things? Do you have red tides? And on and on and on. There's a lot of things to think about there. I'll stop there, but hopefully that gives you a sense of the answer to your question.
Where in the world are most scallops grown?
Asia, Japan and China in particular. China is the leader in the production of bay scallops, those Aquapecten irradians. Japan has a separate species that seems more like ours. It's called Patinopecten yezoensis. It grows pretty large. It also has a fluted shell, lots of waves in it. And as far as Patinopecten goes, Japan, I think, is the world leader in production.
What are the costs associated with scallop farming?
You have to pay for seed, so you have to buy seed, have to have equipment. You have to have the site that we talked about earlier. So you have to pay to apply. There's a rental fee, say $100 per acre per year. There is other associated equipment that you'll have to pay for, your boat, moorings, ropes, buoys, all that kind of stuff, chain. If you are harvesting for sale, then there's probably sets of insurances that you'll want to have. And then there are all the labor costs associated with that. And a lot of times, especially beginning farmers, they don't account for their own costs. Like, they don't pay themselves, but your time has value, or the farmer's time has value. And so all of these are various expenses associated with scallop farming, or really any kind of farming enterprise.
I know commercial fishermen who fish for or harvest scallops, they shuck them before they bring them to shore. Is it the same for aquaculture? Before you sell, do you have to get rid of the shell?
Unless you have special permissions from the Department of Marine Resources, yes, you have to shuck your scallops at sea, so you can only land the adductor muscle.
How can you tell the difference between a male and a female scallop?
After about a year, an individual scallop will start to develop reproductive material. So their gonads are developing, and the male gonad is kind of an off-white color, and the female gonad is anything from an orangey color to fire engine red. And so as you open the scallop, if it's at all sexually mature, you'll be able to see immediately.
How long does it take for scallops to grow? Or like, what's the size before you do anything with them?
Spat collectors go into the water usually at the end, around the third week of September. They stay in the water all winter long, and they'll come out of the water anywhere typically between April through July. At that point, the scallops are about, say, 8 months post-settlement or post-set. And you might get a scallop anywhere from, say, 3 millimeters, maybe up to the size of your thumbnail, like a centimeter or so. So let's call that 9 months post-settlement, although you really haven't done anything. You've just kind of waited at that point. After that, after you take your scallops out of the spat collectors, then you're going to go into the nursery gear, usually a lantern net or a bottom cage or a pearl net. After anywhere from 9 months to a year after that, you should have animals that are about 2 inches in size, 50 millimeters or so. There are markets for whole animals at that size. At that point, if you do have a market for them and you do have the permission and if the product is safe, you could go to market with an animal this big. At this point, I should say that once you take the scallops out of the spat collector, when they're fingernail size, there's a market for those as well. So not everybody collects their own seed. So if you're a farmer who has to buy seed, that means that there's a farmer who's got to sell it too. So there's revenue that comes out there. After that 2-inch size, maybe 9 to 12 months or so, if you keep growing your scallops for, say, another year, you should have scallops that are approaching 4 inches in size if your husbandry is good and if your site is good.
How large can scallops grow in the wild?
Pretty big. I think the largest scallop shell is probably around 9 inches and change in diameter. And the largest scallop meat that I've seen is about 1/2 pound.
Don't fishermen use like the scallop rings, right? So like if it falls through, then they can't harvest them.
Correct.
Is that different for aquaculture?
It is. And the reason is that the aquaculture regulations in general for shellfish will exempt the grower from the kinds of regulations that apply to commercial harvesters. Depending on how you look at it, from the farmer's perspective, they're raising the animals from the get-go, so they should be able to do with them what they want
right
at any time during that process. From the wild harvester's perspective, they are regulated because the regulators want to maintain a certain level of biomass in the harvested stock. You don't want to ruin the scallop stock by allowing people to harvest all the little babies there because you wipe everything out.
right
So it's a dual track there.
How are scallops affected by red tide? Like, would it affect the part that you eat?
The adductor muscle, or the meat that normally you and I eat and we wrap bacon around it or what have you, that part of the scallop, that particular kind of tissue, almost always does not pick up red tide toxins. It can, but it's very rare. And so just to be specific, the toxins mostly that we're talking about here are saxitoxin, which causes paralytic shellfish poisoning, and domoic acid, which causes amnesiac shellfish poisoning. The adductor muscle is almost always pretty well immune from those. However, when you start talking about the other tissues, the gill, the mantle, the roe, and particularly the digestive gland, those tissues can become very toxic. And in fact, if you ate the wrong one at the wrong time, it could put you on a ventilator or kill you without too much difficulty. Whole scallops are a high-risk species, which is why we work so closely with the Department of Marine Resources for testing those animals and making sure that public health and safety is ensured, because no one wants to make a person sick. The grower doesn't want it. Certainly the person eating it doesn't want it, and the state doesn't want it. Of those other toxins, the digestive gland, the roe, the mantle, the gills, the digestive gland usually gets the most toxic. It will carry probably 80% of the whole body toxin load in there. And then following that by the mantle and the gill. And then the roe is frequently very low in terms of toxins. It can definitely go above regulatory levels. But as far as the percentage of overall toxins, it's usually much less than 1% of the total toxin load in the scallop body.
Is there any place, just because the situation that it's dangerous if you eat it, if it happens to have it, is there any areas here in the United States that they eat the whole scallop? Because I know in Asia they have a tendency to eat the whole scallop.
In the United States, it's definitely a rarity. There is some harvesting from offshore areas, which have been approved because they have, for years and years and years, been demonstrated to be pretty harmful algal bloom free. So the chances of having quote unquote hot scallops out there is pretty minimal. Having said that, access to whole and live scallops for chefs and for consumers has been pretty much non-existent, more or less. That means that U.S. consumers, and let's face it, American seafood consumers are pretty limited. So eating a whole scallop would be, whoa, this is really foreign to me. The American palate, traditionally, as well as the lack of access to a whole scallop, means that almost no one has ever tried a whole scallop. Marketing that's happened so far with the scallops that we have been able to send to market have had some pretty good feedback. Chefs really dig playing with them so that they can create new dishes and invent things. Consumers who are inclined to try new things and they really like seafood, they're kind of going gaga about it because it's such an unusual seafood as well. And this is not to say that everybody is going to love to eat a raw or a whole scallop. And I definitely don't know how big the market is, only that I can say that there's something worth exploring there for sure.
Have you ever had a whole scallop?
Oh, sure. Yeah, they're good. If you go to Japan or China or Europe, for example, you will find products way beyond just the adductor muscle. You'll find dried adductors. You'll find them boiled and smoked. You'll find smoked whole animals. You'll find dried mantles, all kinds of stuff. And I got to say, there was one experience where we were hanging out with some Japanese scallop farmers in their little workshop right next to the water. And they had this little, it's like a propane heater stove, and they put a little tin plate on it. They shucked some scallops, put the scallops on that tin plate, and a couple minutes later, the seawater in the scallop shell is starting to boil. And so you're kind of pan roasting a scallop in its own shell right there. And you take the other shell and you clip off the digestive gland, and you just eat it right off the shell. It was so good. So there's a lot of good stuff there to explore.
So what would you compare it to?
The small 2.5 inch scallop, usually referred to like as popcorn scallops or princess size. I like to take them home, steam them so that they open up. The meat will kind of contract and become firmer. I'll just pull off that little digestive gland. It's about the size of a pea, and eat it right like that with a little bit of butter. And it tastes like a combination between a scallop, like a scallop meat, and a soft shell clam. It's very tasty. I find myself standing at the stove or at the sink going, eat, 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 eat. That's what I do.
What is the scallop growing season in Maine?
It's year round. In the hot summer and in the dead of winter, the trick is to handle the scallops as little as possible, because they're not going to want to freeze and they don't want to get too hot and they don't want to dry out. But the farmers still have to do activities like harvesting or cleaning or managing their long lines and that kind of stuff. And that happens dead of winter or right the heat of summer. So that's just part of what the farmer has to do to figure out how to do what they need to do without hurting the crop.
Do you know how many scallops are grown per season, or is it too many to count?
We probably have close to 1 million scallops in culture in the state right now. Annual harvest of scallops in the state is probably pretty low. It's between 50 and 100,000, I should think.
What do you think is the biggest environmental threat to scallops?
I would say it's a mix of things, but temperature and associated salinity, a lot of things happen with temperature. Invasive species, for example, or the growth rate of fouling organisms associated with temperature. So it's not just the effect of the temperature on the scallop itself. And changing currents, for example, perhaps due to changing thermoclines and salinity gradients. acidification is definitely out there as something to keep an eyeball on, because scallops have a very long larval duration for bivalves, about 40 to 45 days. And that means they go a long way, and they're pretty sensitive. So if they're laying down aragonite as their larval shell, and if aragonite saturation levels are really low, that means that larva is going to have a really hard time of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it's the multiple effects, mostly from temperature and salinity.
Do you think the green crab is like a big predator to them, or no?
Inshore, yes. Offshore, less so.
How do scallops affect the environment around them? Do they filter and clear the water like oysters?
Yes, they do. And they can effectively filter a particle down to, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's in the 2 to 4 microns range. So they're fairly efficient feeders. They also have pretty high clearance rates, meaning that of the particles that pass over the gill, they can filter out a high percentage of those. A lot of times a particle will encounter the gill, and the gill is where feeding happens as well as respiration. Those particles, as you may already know, they're bound up in mucus and then ejected as pseudofeces. The gill is a pretty fabulous organism. And so they're filtering the water, which means that they're removing nitrogen, phosphorus. They're grazing down algal populations. Those quote-unquote biodeposits, pseudofeces and real scallop poop, those will frequently make it to the bottom. And those biodeposits are used by animals that live in and on the bottom as food. So they affect the benthic community there as well. They have, I think, probably a minor effect on habitat, because they will dig a little dish of a depression, especially as they get older. And so those are the principal ecological impacts that they have.
What is the best way to cook scallops?
For me, the best way to cook a scallop is not to cook a scallop. It's to open up the shell, to shuck out the meat and eat it right there. That's delicious. On the other hand, I'm pretty pragmatic, and a seared scallop with a little bit of salt and pepper is pretty fine. And one of the things that I really like about scallops is that, or one of the things that I really like about doing this work is that I'm getting exposed to new dishes all the time. So if you go to penbayfarmscallops.com, you will find a cookbook that was put together by Marnie Reed Crowell and Marsden Brewer, and it's got scallop recipes from all around the planet. And so if you're into this kind of stuff, you can try all kinds of things. And now that we have whole scallops for sale, you can actually get those in case you want to try some of those recipes.
Oh, is there any special equipment in harvesting scallops?
Yeah, the principal methods that people use to harvest scallops in Maine and throughout the region are diving. We do have probably 70 divers in the coast of Maine. They're pretty hardy people. So hand picking by divers is number one. The second is using a drag of some sort. I will get gear nerdy here because I'm a fishing gear technologist by training. You will frequently refer to a scallop drag referred to as a dredge. And that's just common terminology. It's not really a dredge. A dredge is something that will fluidize the sediment by using air or water jetted in there. So you're going to hear me refer to a scallop drag as opposed to a scallop dredge. And drags come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, anything from 2 or 3 feet wide to 15 feet wide and 3 tons. And these are, as the name implies, they're dragged behind their boat. They either have teeth on them or not to help dig into the sediment. And they'll have some kind of metal mesh bag or ringed bag that follows it to capture the collected scallops and other critters that fall into it. So those are the 2 principal gear methods.
You referred to the ancient growing technique of the ear, what do you call it, ear
hanging.
Ear hanging. Could you just describe that a little bit more?
Sure. I wish I had a scallop here to show you. But let's see. So here's my hand, and on a scallop, it's got a hinge, right? So here's that flat hinge. Somewhere close to that flat hinge On the bottom side of the scallop, if you look at that hinge, you're going to see a little indentation, and that's called the byssal notch. That's where the foot sticks out and where the byssal gland secretes the byssal fluid. What the Japanese have invented is a way to drill in that byssal notch. So you're really only cutting through the top shell. And that leaves a hole of about 1.5 millimeters in size. And that means you can take a barbed plastic pin or a piece of plastic thread and feed it through that hole. Then you, so I'm using what I've got at hand. Here's a cable. Now you've got a rope with a bunch of pins stuck in the rope. And from those pins, you'd have a scallop hung like earrings. That's the method. The rope itself will hang vertically, as do the scallops. And it takes up a lot of space, and it requires machinery to be efficient and profitable. But once you get all that stuff squared away, it's a pretty good way to grow scallops.
Mm-hmm. What's the difference between a bay scallop and a scallop?
They are separate species. They are separate families. The sea scallop, Placopecten, gets much bigger, and it can live for 20 years or maybe a little bit more. Its shell is relatively smooth. It doesn't have those flutes in it. It's also monoecious. It is only one sex, and it stays that sex throughout its entire life, as opposed to an eastern oyster, which usually starts off as male and then becomes female, and then it might flip-flop. Sea scallops are monoecious, and bay scallops are hermaphroditic. Bay scallops are also much smaller. They have the fluted shell, and they only live 2 years. You can get the occasional one that will live 3 years, but 90+% of the population dies after 2 years. Okay. And their ranges are different. The bay scallop will be able to tolerate much warmer waters.
Well, this has been great. Thank you for joining us at the Boothbay Sea and Science Center this summer. We wish we could have done this in person, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that we're going to be able to see you next summer over at Darling Marine Center.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.